If you didn't hear before, this is the Dallas Cowboys pregame show presented by the Sports Narrative. I'm Dustin Copening. He's Jeff Bowers. We're going into our introductory segment here as we talk news and notes around the NFL, specifically referring to your Dallas Cowboys. And then we'll go into the chalkboard, inside the numbers, and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
But first, let's discuss the heartbreaking news as Mr. Bowers, the whiplash of the NFL and Ezekiel Elliott in the courts. It got me as trying to read the tea leaves of the news that was coming out of the courtroom this week. The Second Circuit ruling on the emergency injunction that Ezekiel Elliott and the NFLPA were looking for. And they said, no. You get no injunction. You get no relief. You will sit for 6 games for something you may or may not have done. Just a real quick recap of what this means. So, last week on Monday, the judge before the Second Circuit, Judge Fiala, ruled that Ezekiel Elliott's temporary restraining order was null and void. He was not getting his preliminary injunction, to which the NFLPA and Ezekiel Elliott then filed for an emergency injunction. The Second Circuit, the Second District Circuit, whatever you want to call them,
Right.
The Southern District of New York, gave him a reprieve for the weekend that allowed him to play against the Chiefs. And then they had the ruling on Thursday afternoon, or the hearing Thursday afternoon, as Ezekiel Elliott was in court in the Southern District of New York. And they said, no, sir, you do not get your injunction, which was a little surprising, again, considering the questioning that was coming from the judges. But as some people were reporting going into that, this is the land of Article 46, the precedent of Tom Brady.
Yep.
And so it was a bit of an uphill battle for Ezekiel Elliott, so he will sit this weekend and for possibly the next 6 weeks. We say possibly because the court did rule that he will get an expedited hearing. That hearing will take place on December 1st. So in theory, if Ezekiel Elliott somehow wins this court battle against the NFL, it would happen after 4 weeks of the suspension.
Right. Which
but
it's around December 1st, which they have that game on November 30th against the Redskins because they're playing that Thursday night game. So he would miss the full 4. He would come back he potentially could come back for those other 2.
Yeah. I would think at this point, as things have played out, that is highly unlikely.
Yeah.
You never know.
I agree. I think... Look, I think this thing has come to the conclusion, the ultimate conclusion that we kind of all thought it would, even though, it definitely took some twists and turns, and we, as you pointed out last week, I think most, even people that get paid a hell of a lot more than we do to do this show, had gotten tired head and completely just kind of, wanted this thing to be over with. And ultimately, finally, it is. And, it sucks for the Cowboys. It sucks that it happens at this time, especially after a nice 3-game winning streak where, you basically beat up a terrible Niners team, a completely wounded Warrior Redskins teams, by the way. Happy Veterans Day to all you out there. And then beat a very good Chiefs team that, was a very solid win at home. And so you just kind of felt like you got your mojo back. You got beat up coming out of that Chiefs game. And now Zeke gone for 6. So the question, I think, more than, look, we'll figure out what they're going to do. We'll talk about that as the show goes on. And we'll talk about, we all kind of know what this means for the league, that it's still Goodell's party and that we're probably going to have some kind of strike or a lockout.
We'll talk more on that in a second, by the way.
Right. But I think the most important thing for me is to ask someone who is a Cowboys fan, as yourself, Mr. Copening, You said several weeks ago that you thought Zeke should have taken this thing, off the bat. Now, obviously, there's all the other stuff. There's him coming out saying, "Look, I'm not an abuser." We don't know whether he actually did this or not. I will point out, and I actually had this was pointed out this week on local sports radio, and I was like, "Oh yeah," which was, yes, there were no charges filed against him. But also, it was the Columbus Police Department in Ohio State, where he happens to be a big star there. So when we look back at the precedent that local police departments show in college towns, I don't think that's necessarily a get-out-of-jail-free card, so to speak. So, with all that being said, do you think he should have just taken it? You probably would have ended up 2-3, or somewhere in that ballpark anyway, or 3-3 after 6 games. And you would now be sitting here ready for the stretch run, ready for the Eagles next week, and a Falcons game that's massively important with your boy, and now you don't.
Yeah, so a lot of things there. If I'm talking strictly as a Dallas Cowboys fan,
yeah,
I would have liked the suspension to take place 3 weeks ago or before that. But reality is this is different, and we've talked about how Ezekiel Elliott has said this is more than football. That's why he was fighting this. This is his name. So you get into the gray area of what's best for him, what's best for the team. So, yeah, when we broke that down and we talked about what might be best for the Cowboys. The interesting thing at the time when we talked about that is that was when the Cowboys, I think, were 2-3 going into the bye week, right?
Yep.
And it was one of those conversations of, listen, if this team is not going to make the playoffs, if they're not going to be competitive, then hey, take the 6 games now, in theory, and drop 4 out of those 6 and go into next season with a bit of a better draft position, you have a chance to improve the defense even more, and you're in great shape. Well, the reality of the landscape has shifted since then. The Cowboys now, with the reality of without Ezekiel Elliott, are 5-3. If the playoffs began today, they have that second or the first wild card, as the Falcons, their opponent this afternoon, would have the last wild card. So I think this team going into the suspension is in pretty good shape. The interesting thing that I posited on my Twitter account at SNUtilityMan was a poll saying, hey, what do you think these Cowboys are going to do during this next 6-game suspension? And the majority of the votes said 3-3, which if that's the case, you're coming into the last 2 games of the season with an 8-6 record. And we'll break down here in just a few seconds what that means as far as your playoff position. But again, going back to the Ezekiel Elliott suspension and what this means for him and the Cowboys, I think this is a moment where you are obviously going to realize how much he means to your team, but you're going to also find out how important the rest of this team is and how complete this team is and how much of the strides we think this team has taken to this point in the season are in reality to the importance of one player. You could argue that Ezekiel Elliott doesn't crack the top 3 of this Cowboys team as far as MVP candidates. However, you're missing a guy this week that you could argue supersedes Ezekiel Elliott's importance with this team. And so there's a lot of interesting things going into this week's matchup against those Falcons.
And that's the big thing for me is that, I mean, I look back at last week's game with, versus Kansas City, and I'm hard-pressed to think, I'm not sure the Cowboys win that game without Zeke. The extra yardage that he got, the little plays that he made in that game were so huge early on, especially to give them the lead. and let them play their type of game. Granted, the defense was better, and we'll talk all about that crap. But
yeah,
honestly, that's one of the first games this season that I've thought, if you didn't have Zeke in this game, I'm not sure you win.
interesting.
I think the other one would have been the Arizona game. And so now I look at that with, now you're playing in that same caliber of a playoff type of team in Atlanta this week, and I'm going to be fascinated to see how that works. Do these drives stall now? We've seen this offense cranked up and rolling, but we've seen it cranked up and rolling against either with Zeke rolling, as we've seen the last couple of weeks, or previous to that. Granted, they're scoring 30 points against the Rams. Well, the Rams defense is not very good. They scored against the Niners. They scored 40. Well, the Niners are terrible. Those kinds of things. So now are we looking at a thing where we go back and we remember what things were like way, way, way back when we played the Broncos and, those types of things? That's what concerns me about this team.